Right, well, we seem to have hit 100 people in the room and it's 5 o'clock, so I think we'll make a start. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to Green Party Live. We're running these sessions every other Monday at the moment and trying to look at the breadth of policies that the Green Party has. So we're gathering Green friends, members and supporters to look at those policies, to ask some questions of specialists in the area and look at how we can create the change that's needed to deliver our environmental, social and economic justice. Now, you may be disappointed to see me presenting here and chairing here, but Natalie Bennett was planning to be with us, but unfortunately she's busy in the House of Lords tonight, so she sends her apologies and you'll have to make do with me. I'm Phil Horton. I'm a member of Eastleigh Green Party, the Climate Emergency Policy Working Group and the Energy Policy Working Group, and I've been a Green Party member since 2019. So before we share the policy that we're going to be talking about tonight, which is around land use, we'd like to remind everybody that as per our first one of these presentations, that they're all available online. No policy is an island, so all of these policies we're discussing relate to each other. None of them stand alone. They all connect to create a web of change, and that impacts on climate change and all other aspects of the environment. So we need to remember that everything we decide when we're voting on policies at conference and so on relates to other parts of the policy body that we have. So before we jump into the main conversation, a little bit of housekeeping. There's going to be plenty of time for a Q&A at the end, so please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat, and use the voting buttons to increase the popularity of any questions you particularly want to be asked. So the chat you can use for communicating with each other and for making general comments, but we'll be looking at the Q&A at the end to decide which questions to ask the panelists. So please join me in welcoming our guests for tonight. So we're going to go around the screen and people are going to tell you what their involvement is with policy making at the Green Party, how long they've been with the party and why they do what they do for us. So I'm going to go around my screen. I'll start with Anne Gayfer.
Hello, yeah, my name's Anne Gayfer. I'm from South Lincolnshire Green Party. The way I got involved in Policy Fest policy was by going to Policy Fest in Nottingham, and that was really just because it was local to me and I'd heard that it was quite a good crack. That was the first time I'd done anything to do with policy making, so I didn't know anything about it before just over 2 years ago. And then at the end of the day, somebody I didn't know very well said, will you chair the land use meeting? And by the way, it starts in 10 minutes. So I thought, I was a bit shocked, but I said, okay, I'll do that. And ever since I have convened the land use policy working group. And I have to say, it's been an absolutely fascinating journey. I've learnt a lot. I've met some great people, and I would encourage anybody here who's not already involved in policy to dip their toe in the water. Before, I suppose, we've been asked to say a bit about our background. I was self-employed before COVID, doing talks and shared an individual reflexology and Reiki treatments, but that's sort of fallen by the wayside since the pandemic. And I also work at a local school and spend a lot of time on the allotment, walking and doing other things for the Green Party. So that's me.
Thanks, Anne. And David?
Well, thank you, Phil. I'm a chemist by original training and an IT consultant by professional discipline. I retired in 2008 and cast around for something to do which would exercise my mind and which might have some importance. Climate change jumped out at me as being a major thing facing the whole world, really. And since I knew that I would never be a climate scientist, I thought about policy and joined the Green Party, because for policy, you need a platform to stand on. So then, discovering that there was no effective policy working group on climate, I decided I'd better get on and make it work, which makes me the convener of the Climate Emergency Policy Working Group. I'm a member of the Transport, Energy, and one or two other policy working groups, but climate is my thing. And climate, of course, the purpose is to get emissions down to the point at which the climate we love might actually survive.
Thanks, David. I think you'll have heard already that just throwing yourself in and getting involved means you can rapidly become quite important in policy making in the Green Party. So yeah, we'll move on to Peter. Peter next.
Hello, so I'm Peter Sims. I've been in the Green Party over 5 years now. I can't remember, no, probably, I joined at university, so about 6-7 years ago, something like that. I'm currently quite heavily involved in the Land Use Policy Working Group and also the Tax and Fiscal Policy Working Group. I'm in Decorum Green Party, which is in the Chilterns on the edge of Hertfordshire. And I'm also outside the Green Party, I'm also involved in the core group of Greenhouse Think Tank, which is another policy research green thinking organisation. So that also gives me some relevant knowledge for this discussion tonight. I will leave it at that.
Thanks, Peter. And Tony.
Yes, hello. I'm Tony Firkins. I'm from the Hounslow Green Party. I'm a member of a number of policy working groups, including the Land Use Policy Working Group that Anne Gayfer was referring to at the beginning, as I went to the same meeting at Policy Fest in Nottingham. I've been a member of the Green Party for about 12 years, and I soon got involved in the sort of climate policy and trying to work out how we could improve it. A bit about my background is that I've given on previous sessions of this, that I used to be work in computers, in particular, latter part of my career, I worked for Tesco Mobile, which I was involved in the design of before we started. And by the time we'd finished, we had 5 million customers. So that was kind of a startup type idea. But I thought I would add on this particular session that I used to be a farm worker and I specialized in potato harvesting and strawberry picking. So that's what I bring to the Land Use Policy Working Group, as well as some of my climate and energy policy knowledge. Okay, thank you. That's it from me.
Thanks, Tony. I see that George has also joined us here. I don't know whether Georgia wants to say hello as well. I don't think you're officially part of the panel tonight, but you're part of the policy working group, aren't you? So it'd be really good to hear from you as well.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was also at that Nottingham Policy Fest, but I didn't go to that particular meeting. I'm in the Climate Emergency Policy Working Group, and I've been working on some of the international policy recently, but I had also been running a subgroup on economic policy. And my background is in international development, and I've worked for government and private sector in that respect. That's me. Nice to meet you.
Thanks, Georgia. Great. So as you can hear, we've got a very experienced group of people to answer your questions tonight. And we've got a few kind of preset questions, first of all, to look at the need for the policy, this particular policy that we're discussing, and the problems that we're trying to address. So first of all, I'm going to ask Peter a question here, which is thinking, first of all, beyond Green Party of England and Wales. So land use is a global problem. Many parts of the world are looking at the issue. So what's the impact of the decisions we're making here in the UK on global land use, and how do we make those decisions address or cause stress to social and environmental justice? So what's the impact of those decisions that we make here?
Thank you, Phil. It's a very important angle to consider when thinking about what we do in the UK, because there's a very simplistic argument that it's other countries' decision what happens in other parts of the world, but actually that's very much not the case due to the way the world economy works at the moment. So so if you look at food as a particular example, but it's also true for minerals and various other things, and some degree energy as well. What we don't produce here to meet our needs, however there's an argument about how our needs are defined, we tend to import, and therefore that sometimes referred to as ghost hectares, or that requires land in other parts of the world. So if we don't grow our green beans or our peas or whatever in this country, then there's another piece of land somewhere else in the world that is producing that food that we are then consuming. So in the same way as you can have emissions embedded in imports, you can also have land use embedded in imports, and that's as true as it is for it's particularly true for food. some degree it's true for energy. If we think of energy in a sort of PV land area, or land use for wind farms and things like that. It's also true to some degree for minerals and mining. If we don't mine lithium in the UK, that's lithium that's being mined in another country, and there, so land use is a very interconnected global issue in that sense. And the other important part to tease out is that it's, and this is true at a local level as well as a global level, is that it's not as simple, it's very easy to say demand, but actually what demand is a very complicated thing, because it depends on how we share things, to how resources are shared, which is particularly true when it gets to food justice and these issues. But it's also true for other resources. The amount of lithium we use affects the amount of land that needs to be used to mine it. And then there's also the separate question of where that land goes. So it is a very complicated issue, and it is a very interconnected issue. And that's one of the things that I think, since the land use policy working group. So I have an engineering background, and a lot of that systems engineering. And one of the things that really jumped out to me since I got involved in the land use policy working group about 18 months, 2 years ago, was how interdependent all the different decisions are. So what we decide in terms of food and diet policy, for the UK, has massive implications for land use, and then that has implications, and then that is also implications therefore for energy and for forestry policy, and then that links into biodiversity, because how we use our land then affects what space there is for other species and for biodiversity. But it's not just as simple as, well, if we've used land for one thing, we can't use it for other things, because there's a lot of opportunities for using land, co-uses of land, if you want to use it like that. So it becomes a very complicated issue. I could speak for a while, but I'll leave it there for the moment.
So I'm assuming that there's some quite complicated spreadsheets then.
Yeah, if you want to. Well, with all problems where you want to try and quantify it, one of the things that became very clear early on when we started looking at land use in the party was that if you don't try and quantify things, you can end up with a situation where lots of different policy areas thinks they've got a great policy, they've got a great policy in terms of food and diet for the UK, they've got a great policy for energy for the UK, but actually, unless you start to quantify what the implications for these things are in terms of land use, but also perhaps in terms of other things as well, you then don't realise how they all relate together. And actually, there is only so much land. The really critical thing about land, which isn't true so much for things like energy, is that there is a set amount of land. It is, it is finite, and this has been reflected in lots of great pieces of literature work and all the rest of it. Where I think there's a quote in one of them in the Green Party's philosophical basis around land is the fundamental resource we have to look after. It is both a resource in the sense it's something that we make use of, but it's also something that we should consider ourselves part of. We should consider ourselves dependent on, and it's something that ultimately it's something we share with the rest of with biodiversity. And because it's finite and because of that balance, we have to look very carefully, and that does involve quantifying things, and that then leads you down into spreadsheets, I'm afraid.
Okay. So that leads on very well actually to the next question, which is for Anne. So the Green Party aims to transition to a society that promotes well-being for all living beings, so not just for humans, and regeneration of the environment on which we all depend. So there's a potential tension there between human and non-human needs. So how do we attempt to address that through Green Party policy?
Okay, in my answer, you're going to hear 3 words that Peter has just used, and I think they go right the way through our policies. One of them is systems, one of them is complexity, and the other one is dependency. So I'd expand your question a bit, Phil, to say that the Green Party policies focus on promoting the well-being for ecosystems, and that will make it more likely that the environment can be depended on to support us. And I think, again, another problem that we're addressing all the time is that it's easy to see the tension that's developed. Some of us have lived through that. Since I was a child, I've seen, sort of things get more and more complex, and the tension between human and non-human needs become greater and greater. But it's much harder to work out how to unravel that tension, and that's where the complexity comes in. And we've seen that really, we have to go back to the Industrial Revolution, and even before that to see this complexity starting to develop. So we've got an awful lot to unravel very, very quickly. So to answer your question directly, the Green Party aims to develop policies that help to address this tension through policies that interlinked, and again, hence this series that we're running. And in this session, we are hoping to explain a bit about how we've started to unpack the problem as we perceive it from the perspective of land use, and hope to answer some questions that might enable us to also develop solutions based around problems to do with land use.
Right. So do you ultimately think that there is a tension there between human and non-human needs, or do you think they're all interrelated and ultimately what we do will help both?
I think the way that society is going at the moment, there's definitely a tension, but I think working with Peter and Tony, we believe, I wouldn't say that we found the perfect solution, the silver bullet or anything, but we do think that if we are a bit more careful about how we use our land, that we do actually have enough land in this country, but it does mean that we've got to make a fundamental shift in the way that we do things and the way that we eat. And in fact, those will probably have health benefits and spin-offs for jobs as well, but we do need to start doing things differently.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the important things about all the policies, actually, is we tend to be looking at the current problems and trying to find solutions, but actually the solutions are positive in all sorts of ways outside of those problems, aren't they? It's a positive future that we're projecting here.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Anne. So a question for David now as convener of the Climate Emergency Policy Working Group. So in the context of land use, can you talk a bit about how that impacts on global heating, climate change, and climate breakdown, and what's that looking like again globally as well as for what we're doing in the UK?
Right. Well, let's take the thing in the whole. The problem obviously is the greenhouse gases, and the problem with the greenhouse gases, largely carbon dioxide, is that they trap heat. It's a fine balance. If we didn't have any of that, then the place would be awfully cold and wouldn't be us. If we had too much of it, then the planet would be about like Venus, ridiculously hot, intolerable for life. So we need to be at the right point, the Cinderella, the Goldilocks area, not too big, not too small. The bulk of the greenhouse gases are result from the burning of fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal. That relates to engineering activity, transport industry, and that's not what we're going to talk about today, but it is about 2/3 of the whole impact. What's left is impacts coming from land. Now, as Mark Twain said, by land, they're not making it anymore. The amount of land is finite, but how we use it is not. And what we've seen is there has been a shift running back centuries, but particularly over the last century, in the way we use land. And more land has come under human cultivation. And that has consequences. One of the consequences is that we get methane emissions. Now, methane emissions come largely from cattle and sheep obviously produce meat and milk. And as the people of the world get more prosperous, they want to eat more meat, just how it is. So that's the driver, and that's a big shift ongoing. The other gas, often not mentioned, but it matters, is nitrous oxide, and the release of nitrous oxide is largely due to the use of fertilizers containing nitrogen. They come from industrial processes, but the emissions occur on the land. Nitrous oxide, methane, and some carbon dioxide. And the other carbon dioxide thing to talk about in terms of land is deforestation, and particularly where that produces burning. As we see across Brazil, across Indonesia, we get lots of excess CO2. In a stable world, that CO2 would be reabsorbed by future trees or by other trees just downwind. But as we are reducing that, then that will not be the case. And so some of that CO2 will find itself more or less permanently into the atmosphere, contributing to climate change, with the obvious knock effects of flooding, extreme weather, etc. I think everyone on the call understands most of that, but that's how land fits into the picture.
Great. Thank you, David. So we're going to delve a little deeper into some of the key questions now. So having said that we've got kind of positive solutions, my next question to Peter is about what are the problems that make these policies around land use necessary, land and food necessary? I think you've already answered some of this, but just go into a bit more depth about what we're trying to address and how we're trying to do that.
Yes, thank you, Phil. I will. I'll just going to say one other thing first, which sort of linked back to what Anne and David said, which is I think it's important to get to look at the sort of the root causes of how we've got to the land use situation that we have at the moment, which is then having these these greenhouse gas implications, but also lots of other implications that have negative impacts on both our society and societies around in other places of the world. Lots of issues around pollution and land rights issues in lots of places of the world, but also lots of issues around biodiversity loss, which is that co-challenge, and it's important to recognize that we can't solve any, if we just focus on climate change, we just focus on biodiversity, we can very easily move the problem round rather than actually addressing it. And I think if you try and look at some of the root causes of all those these implications of current land use policy, it comes back to this view of this viewpoint around we currently, a lot of the language we use, a lot of the way we talk about land use, it invokes this idea of control. It's how we use our land, not how we interact with the wider world. How we frame the problem very much restricts what solutions are available. I think it's interesting to acknowledge that a lot of indigenous communities don't have a word for nature because they consider themselves part of it. So why would you have a word for everything but us? So I think if you start to look at the root causes, it's seeing ourselves as part of this interdependent system rather than this thing that sits above it that dictates and exploits and uses. To come back to your direct question around food and land use, so we know we have these various implications, and we know that a lot of those are linked to specific land use practices. So if you want to, peatland is quite a good example to bring up. There are lots of emission, because we have drained a lot of peatlands, a lot of bogs, sometimes for agriculture, sometimes for peat extraction, for various reasons. That has then led to emissions. So if we want to restrict those emissions, we need to change the way that those pieces of land are managed. And then, so if you look at that, you've got to look at, well, why does that land managed the way it is at the moment, and what interventions could happen in terms of subsidies, in terms of taxes, in terms of prohibiting certain practices, or so on and so forth. And that peatland is just one example. You've got to think about all of the different aspects of land use that are problematic and what is driving them. If you look back through history, a lot of land was used, not necessarily optimally, but certainly in balance with nature in lots of circumstances. It wasn't always, but there are examples of where it was. And how have we got from there to where we are now? So the way we look at this in the land use policy that is currently being developed is looking at policy levers is the framing we've used. So what are the different levers or tools available to elected governments in order to influence how land is used? So some of these are taxes. So for instance, carbon taxes. If you levy a carbon tax against fossil fuels, for instance, that changes the price of different practices. And therefore, very industrially intensive farming practices, for instance, might become more expensive as a result of that because they rely to some degree on fossil fuels. Another one is things like land value tax. Do you want me to go into how much detail you want to go into?
So we've got some questions further on, I think, about solution implementation. So we'll look at the policy levers a little bit more there, I think. So I think we've kind of got a really good picture there of what the problems are that we're trying to address. And certainly in my day-to-day work, part of what I've been doing, I work for the Royal Yachting Association on sustainability there, and it's looking at things like those intertidal habitats, and that really does demonstrate how all these things link together, because pollution and turbidity stops it from growing, which reduces the protection from storms, which are going to get worse due to climate change and sea level rise. And it just shows how all of these things link together, the biodiversity and the land use change. And that land use change on the coast with nitrates getting into the water impacts on all those different habitats. So I think it's a great demonstration of how all the policies connect again. So thank you.
And that nitrate pollution then links you back to farming, because a lot of that comes from runoff from so it all goes in full circle. So you have,
absolutely, yeah. No, thanks, Peter. That's great. So coming over to Anne now. So I think Peter mentioned this briefly, but or indirectly, but land ownership and the systems of land ownership we have. Do you think they contribute to the problems that we face, and how does how do we address that through policy again? And can we look at collective land ownership and how that would address social and environmental justice as well?
Yeah, I think it's undoubtedly the case that the system we have, which dates back to the Norman Conquest in 1066, is not great. Because it places the land under the control of descendants of William the Conqueror, and it is quite surprising if you look into it to find that most of that land is still held by these families, and they, of course, because they own the land or they hold the land. Ownership is quite a complicated subject. They can do what they wish with it. So I think one of the problems is that if you look at an aerial map of the UK, it seems as if we've got quite a lot of green space in the UK, or if you fly over the country, it looks very green. But we're actually very short of land because the people who are in control of it are squandering it. And I just like to make the point that it's quite well understood that we outsource our carbon emissions to other countries, and I think it's been alluded to that we do a similar sort of thing with land use. But I just sort of like to make it quite clear that we are outsourcing our carbon emissions. We're also outsourcing our land use by importing food. But up until the 1970s, we were actually more or less self-sufficient in this country, and so in the last 50 years, we've outsourced about 40% of our land to other countries, and that's not. So you're going to.
Can I just?
Yep.
You just imply. I don't think it's entirely true to say that we were self-sufficient up until the 1970s, because there was a. Apologies, there's a street nearby. There's a big issue in the late 19th century with dependent on imported grain, and I think because the Beveridge report that happened during the Second World War, I think highlighted our dependence on imported food even pre then. So I think since the Industrial Revolution, there's been a general decline, although it's gone up into the ups and downs. I agree that post-war there was a bit of a increase in food self-sufficiency, but I don't think we've been self-sufficient for a long time.
Okay, sorry. I stand corrected. Okay, so it's quite clear that we need to change the way our land is owned or used, because we haven't got enough for our current needs. And there are a whole host of changes we need to look at. We're quite optimistic in our working group that we can develop policy to make these changes, but it will be quite hard, I think, to actually make the changes in practice, and this is one of the challenges that we face. But we don't think that, obviously there's going to be a problem taking land away from people or removing their ability to make choices over land that they hold. But we do think that it is possible to make changes that won't be to the detriment of the environment and social justice. And in fact, we think to the contrary. So, I talked about the environment in the previous question that I answered, but as far as social justice is concerned, the Green Party has got a raft of policies to tackle social injustice. And we think that our land policies could improve job opportunities and people's health by creating local jobs and giving people more control over their land use, and also providing more nutritious food.
Can I add on to Anne's answer to that question a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I was just going to briefly come back to Anne and just say, do you think part of that might be a proper land registry for a start? Because I don't know if you see Guy Shrubsole's book on Who Owns England. We don't know who owns most of it. So do you think that would be a key part of it, Anne, to actually understand that in the first place?
Yes. That is going to be one of our policy suggestions, is that all land is registered. I can't remember the percentage that isn't registered, but it's actually surprisingly high.
And transparency, knowing who land is currently owned by who, is the first thing in terms of change how bits of land is used. Because if you don't know who owns a piece of land, well, you can't then work with them to try and work out how it can be, how to ensure it's better used. And I think the other thing that we've tried to highlight in our thing is that there's a hierarchy about how you implement these interventions, as it were, how you apply policy levers. And the first stage is obviously to work with the people who own the land at the moment, because the people who own the land in the moment, often the people who best know that piece of land. And a lot of the time, they don't necessarily want to manage it the way that they currently do, that has some of these implications, or they would at least be interested in managing it differently. A lot of the time, particularly in agricultural land, they've been forced down these routes by price signals, by the economy, by the way the markets are currently organised and the way the subsidy system is currently organised. So the first stage is always to try and work with the current landowners to try and improve the way land is managed.
Great. Thank you both. That's great. So I'm just going to come to Tony now. So Tony does a lot of the energy policy modelling. So can you tell us a little bit more about the aspects of land use that impact carbon emissions, and maybe put some numbers around it as well, because we've already mentioned it in passing, but we need to get some detail on that.
Yeah, sure. I'm very happy to come up with some numbers. But the way I'm going to answer this question is, as part of, we've had an overall model of the energy use and the investment costs and the emissions for some time. This model has covered all of these emissions associated with land use. And with the land use policy working group, we're kind of going even further to understand how the land is used. So we're doing kind of a new iteration of the work. But the first thing to understand, if you want to know where you're going to go, you've got to know where you are at the start. And so where we're starting from in this is looking at the major land emissions. And we're using largely the Climate Change Committee's baseline for what these emissions are today. And in terms of land use, those obviously fall under a farming category, which is probably kind of fairly well understood. But there's another category which the UK government has to report its emissions under, which is got a long title of land use change, and forestry. And this is broken down into a number of different subcategories, which we then try to subdivide even further. And to mention a few of them, and to put this all in context, we can think of the UK as having production emissions of about 500 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent a year. So think of that as the big number. And then if we're looking at the land use change and land use, then peatland has come up in the estimate of emissions very much in the last few years. So that's about 25 megatons of CO2. So it might sound, relatively small compared with 500, but it's just one sector. And if we've got to get our emissions to zero, we've got to be thinking about how do you address these emissions from peatland, and where do they come from? And if they come, and quite a lot of them come from fairly small amounts of land, which you currently use for primary crops, agricultural land, and primary grassland. And so that's a reason, that would be a reason for changing the policy on how that land is used. And that needs to be strengthened in Green Party policy. There's other land, for example, grassland is a major sector, and we do have in the UK at the moment negative emissions from that land. But it does take over half the country, this grassland, and it's largely used for sheep and cattle. And we will probably have to redistribute that land from grassland, that's current policy, to forestry and potentially to agriculture as well. So although it's a negative emissions at the moment, that we might not get so much negative emissions if we have less grassland. And cropland is another of the emissions categories that the UK has to report on, and that that is very much a positive emissions at the moment, and we've got to look at our policies to see whether the new farming policy, which got recently passed, is going to help. It's certainly going to help to reduce those emissions, but it still looks like we may have rather too many emissions from the cropland. We'll need to look at that in more detail. A lot of, I'm going to, or not to go on too long on this answer, there's we talk in our net zero target for 2030 in terms of carbon dioxide equivalent. And that's a sort of a way of equating other greenhouse gases such as methane and nitrous oxide to be equivalent to carbon dioxide. But that can sometimes be a slightly misleading equivalent. And so we are looking very much at the different gases and the effects they would have. And in terms of the land use, I mentioned that kind of half of the UK is for cattle and sheep, and the methane emissions from the cattle and sheep are of the order of 30 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So, you know, that's getting considerable compared with the total of 500. And we've got to think of ways of getting that down appreciably if we're going to get to the current net zero target, or any other target where you would still be wanting to reduce the methane emissions considerably from what they are today, as they're considerably, the world's methane in the atmosphere is way, way above what it was in pre-industrial times. And the other one is nitrous oxide in terms of a gas and its land use. And it's mostly, as I think David mentioned before, fertilizer use. But it's surprising how much is also due to spreading and grazing as well when the number is broken down a bit more. So we've got to kind of be careful that if we say we're going to use less fertilizer, what are we using instead? And what if it's not applied correctly, how many greenhouse gas emissions are from that? So what the Land Use Policy Working Group in this latest iteration and refinement of policy is to be look at what the land use is currently, look at what the emissions are currently, then have a model of how you would change that land use, but that might take 20 years, and then see, well, how many emissions will be the result of all those policies by 2030, which is a key because that's our target for getting to net zero. And eventually, because some of these land use changes and policies will take some time to implement. It's just not possible to say, we'll do all of that in 5 years' time, we'll be okay. And I managed to have that answer so far without mentioning forestries at all. So I'll stop for now.
Great, thanks, Tony. As you can tell, there's a lot of complexity there, and again, a lot of interactions between the different policy working groups to try and get the figures right and to work out suitable policies. So just looking at the solutions now. Now, Peter's already mentioned a couple of policies that are levers and leverage points for us in land use, but I'm going to come to each of you for maybe one lever each. What you think might be something somewhere within our policy that would help us to change land use away from the current patterns. So Anne, I'm going to come to you first, if that's okay, and see what do you think the leverage points are, key leverage points for you.
If I had to choose one, and again, they are all interlinked, I'd like to see changes to our planning system so that ecosystems are properly valued. I mean, I'm not keen on some of the government work that's being done on valuing ecosystem services, which equates pounds sterling to particular types of activity and puts everything into a sort of economic context. But I'm not sure, I haven't got a solution particularly immediately, but perhaps looking at the way local communities value their local land and giving them more of an input into a say on how things should be done, and then superimposed over that some of the stuff that Tony's talked about the changes that we need to make at a national level and somehow melding those together. So yeah, it'd be a complete overhaul of the planning system for me.
So devolving powers more locally, which is part of our policy, so
Yes.
that people can say, actually, I just want that piece of land to stay as it is, and I don't care about its financial value. That's what I want locally.
But within constraints.
Mhm.
Um,
Tony was putting his hand up about that. Absolutely. So you have a national policy framework that says you've got to achieve X, and then local decisions about how you do it in that particular context. Yeah, great. Thank you. So David, what's your?
I'm going to be boring, and I'm going to say carbon tax. Partly because I always say carbon tax, and partly because we have worked through how the carbon tax would drive change. If you tax the land use emissions, if you assess the impacts of the release of methane and nitrous oxide, you give the farmer a motive for getting his emissions down. And farming is a very distributed business. There are tens of thousands of farmers. So we need to find a way of giving them all a common purpose of getting their emissions down. So when that happens, that flows through the supply chain. Now, some of what will happen is that some farmers will give up keeping cattle and sheep, and that's necessary. There are other things the farmers can do to reduce emissions, but whatever the set of things are, there's a common motive. One of the things that we have as a party is to say not what we would like to happen, but how we would get it to happen. There are lots of things we want to happen, but the policy measures are the things that drive change.
Thanks, David. And Peter, one from you.
Yes, I will. Interesting to follow David's point, because I think the important thing to recognise, because a lot of land use change comes back to agriculture, and I think we also have to recognise that, you know, this webinar is framed around land use, and a huge amount of that is food. We haven't got around this table the food and the agricultural people. We've got the people around this table around land use. So, you know, the people with, you know, first-hand experience of farming are not here to make their case. So I think it's important to recognise that actually farming on the whole in the UK is a subsidised activity. You're not most farm, you know, on average, there's a lot of farmers operating at loss at the moment, and almost all farming in the UK is dependent on subsidies. So actually, the way that we structure land use subsidies is a huge policy lever for changing what happens on farms. You know, and I think, I mean, the current proposals in the land use paper are to use the structure of what you can get land use subsidies for and what you can't, as basically the motivator of reducing emissions from farming activities, because you know, levying a tax in certain circumstances is actually almost counterproductive, because if you're going to have to subsidise them in order to be able to have some money to pay the tax, you might as well just say, well, we're not going to subsidise that activity, and then and subsidise alternative management practices that keep. And the important thing is we've got to keep farming businesses, you know, financially viable, and allow people to see a future in farming, but do it in a way that where, you know, but what that farming activity looks like may look quite different from today. And there may be a shift towards mixed farming, there may be a change in scale, there may be a change of intensity, there may be lots of things. So the land management subsidies I think are a huge, you know, are going to be a very significant policy lever. And if I may mention one other one, which, because you know, I think David,
you might steal Tony's.
Well, I might. I'll stop now. I can mention another one if it's time.
Okay, thanks, Tony. So, David, did you have your hand up about a particular point there where you wanted to respond?
Well, I did, and it's a point which is difficult, but I think it has to be faced. That Peter says rightly that there are overlaps and subsidies, and these things have to be taken together. Absolutely. And he also says that there has to be a future for farming, and that's absolutely right too. But the reality, I think, is that the future for farming will be different, not merely qualitatively, but also quantitatively. That because of the need to reduce animals on the land and to increase forestry, there is going to be less farming and therefore less farmers. And we have to provide a good, secure future.
No, there won't be less farmers. There'll be more farmers. So sorry, David, to contradict you on this, but there'll be a lot less animals. There'll be a lot less livestock. But actually, so currently the UK is very split. So the large portion of the country is very arable farming, so for crops. A large portion of the UK is very animal farming, and that is part of that creates lots of issues in both halves of the countries, and some of that is emissions related. So actually, part of it would be is mixing farming up a bit, so there's a bit more of everything. But also, if you want to deindustrialize farming, so you actually need more labour rather than less labour, and particularly if you want to increase more horticulture. So even if there's a lot less jobs doing animal husbandry part of it, although arguably that might not even be true, there could be a lot more jobs on the land doing farming activities, because currently we have offshored a huge amount of our horticulture production. We don't grow most of our fruit and veg, we don't pick most of our apples, and actually they are the very labour intensive bits of farming. So there may be a shift from high intensity lots of livestock farming towards high human intensity, lots of human labour required, but lower fossil fuel intensity and less animals per hectare.
So I think we're seeing here
what you see here is policy discussion in the raw, with real differences of view and perspective from different parties, and that's one of the things that gives us good policy: multiple perspectives coming together and being shared and argued about. For clearly but respectfully, that's what we do in the Green Party, or at least that's what we ought to do, mostly do.
Thank you both. And Tony, do you have one specific policy lever?
Well, yeah, I've got one which I know we need to talk about because we haven't even mentioned it yet, which is land value tax. But I'm probably not the best person to explain land value tax. But before I kind of refer back to Peter to talk about the land value tax, I'm just going to talk a bit about what we've been doing. And I think this will become a policy lever. It's what people are going to eat and what their diet is. And what we've been doing in the Land Use Policy Working Group is to work from a wellness diet and then work out what food needs to be produced for that diet, which kind of puts things a bit the other way around from what might happen at the moment, which will be kind of driven by where's the best subsidy going to come from, or what is the best price on the market at the moment. And so some of what we will have to do, it will be driven by this diet. And we've done some work as part of the policy development, is to look at that diet and then look at what food needs to be produced, and then look at what the agroecological practices in the farming policy past are, and the yields from that, to work out how much land we need, and to go to the policy of wanting to be self-sufficient in food. That's not no imports, no exports, but it's a net zero import rather than self-sufficient. So we're producing enough food for ourselves, and we're producing what we call enough we're moving towards having enough biotic resources. A lot of that's wood, and to see how that will be used, and to drive those targets towards the sort of land use changes we want. And then I think I should let Peter have a minute or so on the land value tax.
I was just going to briefly say, Tony, that I think that's kind of partly an answer to one of the questions that's come up that's quite popular actually, which is, can we grow enough food for 70 million people and reforest the countryside? And I know we're not onto the Q&A yet, but I think that's probably quite a good opportunity to bring that point in there. So
yeah, well, we can answer it more when you come to the Q&A if there's questions.
Okay. So Peter, if you want to very briefly talk about land value tax, and we'll
yes, Tony has very much set up what I was about to say a moment ago. Land value tax is an absolutely critical policy lever. Let me first explain very briefly what it is. So the value of land is effectively how much it would be worth if you sold it. So it's effect wealth. So a significant proportion of the wealth of the people in the UK is the land in the UK, and so what a land value tax is, it's an annual tax on a small percentage of the value of all the land, and it's a very good way of taxing wealth, which is a good, important from reducing inequality, wealth inequality in the UK, which is an aim of the other parts, you know, of the Green Party policy, because you can't hide land. If it's in the UK, it can be taxed, you know. But because you're taxing, you know, land at its value, it has a number of other side benefits which are very important policy. So it encourages people to use land productively, because land, you know, you have to pay the tax regardless of whether you're using the land and deriving any profit from it. So therefore, it encourages people to make use of land rather than sit on it or hoard it or just don't lock it away and leave it to do nothing. Obviously, there is some land that under the new circumstances might not be worth very much, because it is, you know, unproductive, mostly for mostly used by biodiversity, doesn't have a lot of financial value, in which case the tax levy might be zero, or in some cases perhaps even negative, because the land value tax would in fact be a subsidy in order to manage that land for biodiversity. But in the majority of the cases, that it will have a value, and because you're taxing that value, it suppresses speculation. We have a big problem in the UK with the speculation on land. So a good example of this is, you know, if they're building HS2 or they're building Crossrail, all the people whose houses are near those stations, or, you know, all the land near those stations that are going to suddenly have vastly improved public transport, that goes up in value. So the private person who, you know, owns the plot of land right next to the station that's currently an office box but might get turned into a block of flats, well, they make a huge windfall gain by the public sector paying to build a new bit of transport infrastructure. And land value tax is a way of capturing that increase in value and, you know, paying back into the public purse, as it were, into the public finances, who you know, so you close the loop, as it were. The government invests in things that increase the value of land because they improve public transport, they reduce air pollution, or whatever it is they invest in, and then people pay back, you know, in return for that through land value tax. So it has a number of important side benefits, but it also is a useful policy lever in achieving other pieces of land use change. I'll stop there.
That's great. Thanks very much, Peter. So before we go on to the next section, David, can you give us a quick explanation of how policy is created within the Green Party? And while you're answering it, you could actually answer one of the questions that's proved quite popular in the Q&A, which is Green Party policy development honed over the years as it is optimum? Is it optimum for political as well as academic purposes?
Okay, there's a long answer on policy, which would take us the rest of the night. So let me give the short answer. Most important policies are made by conference. They're made by conference when members of the party, bring motions to conference to change the policy. The best work comes from policy working groups, because there has been an opportunity, as I said earlier, for a group of people to come together and to challenge each other. So that's, on the whole, the best way of getting new policy. And that's why the work of the land use group is valuable, coming back on something that we're seeing now. The detail of that procedure, I think, is too tedious to go into, but it involves various democratic safeguards. And then we go to conference and we vote, at least those who turn up to conference vote, and we get an answer. Is it optimum in any sense? No, I'd say on the whole it isn't. The process, because it is a bottom-up process, we get the policies that some people think are important. Some of us think climate policies are important, so we have a lot of motions on climate policy. Other people have other priorities, but there isn't any top level at which someone is saying, let's have less on this and let's do more on that. That isn't in place. Perhaps it ought to be, but it isn't. And I think some of our political leaders would rather that there was a broader approach. Don't know how to achieve that, but I don't think we've got an ideal solution. Maybe there are no ideal solutions. And I think probably that's the reality, that as in so much of life, you can hope to make the system better, but thinking that you can turn it into an ideal is just not to be achieved in human lifetime.
I think just to add on very briefly to David's point, there's definitely a trade-off between having a democratic policy process where, you know, a lot of issues that don't get heard in a lot of other parties and don't get to be party policy because, you know, the powers that be in certain parties, they don't deem them important, whereas in the Green Party, because there's a democratic process, they can be. You know, that acts, you know, acts against sometimes having a, you know, say an entirely consistent and, you know, the same level of detail, the same level of rigor and all the rest of it. Because if it's democratic, it gets updated incrementally, and, you know, it's an ongoing process. We are still working towards having the set of policies we need.
Absolutely, thank you. So finally, before the Q&A, so one sentence from each of you on this. So what one thing would you tell the people gathered here today to do tomorrow to help contribute to making our land policies a reality? So Anne.
Have a look at our green space, our land use green space, which is on the member website.
Great, thank you, Anne. I think that's very good advice for everybody. David.
Decide what it is you're most interested in and find a policy working group that's working on that. And if there isn't one, well, you could start one.
You can be the chair, you can be the convener.
Just so.
Indeed. Peter.
I'm going to say that the most important thing is to do with our land use policy specifically is try and ensure that you understand some of, not all of the detail, because it's vast and complicated, but pick one or two of the key policy levers and try and, you know, get your head around how a carbon tax works, what the implications be, because things will never come to fruition unless people understand them and communicate them to other people.
Thanks, Peter. And Tony.
Anne mentioned the planning system before. I get involved in your local planning system. I'd see what development is happening out there. How is that influencing how land is used just on your doorstep? And see whether it's signing a petition, writing to your councillor, if you're a councillor, kind of acting upon it. But engage with your local planning system. It's somewhat democratic, and whoever you are, you can engage with it.
Phil, can I say one more thing, please? We've got a draft voting paper going to conference, and if people haven't actually had a look at that, it would be great if they could look at the agenda forum and read it. It's not that long. There's a massive background paper if you're really interested, with over 100 pages in it.
And of course, the critical thing there is to the critical thing there is to support it at conference as well. Come to conference and support it. Great. Well, thank you, everybody. So we'll move on to the Q&A now. We've got quite a lot of questions on here, but I think we could probably group some of them together. So the two most popular questions on here, I guess we've addressed this to some extent, but maybe we could go into a little more depth. And it's around how, well, the second framing of it is the most straightforward, which is, can we grow enough food for 70 million people and reforest the countryside? And the other question was specifically around, you know, points about Devon in particular, where they're struggling with needs for land for different demands. So Tony.
Yeah, I'm going to dive in and then before Peter gets in. So there's two approaches to this in the UK. There's called a land sharing approach, which is more our agroecological approach, and sometimes called extensive farming, where you're kind of coexisting with nature. And then there's the intensive approach. And when it comes to can we feed ourselves, I'm just going to raise the issue of yields. Currently, wheat in this country is about 8 tonne a hectare. And if you look at what the Climate Change Committee is predicting for 2050, it's more like 11 tonnes a hectare. So they're thinking it's going to get even more productive somehow through technological fixes. We have an agroecological policy, which wheat will be at about 4 tonnes a hectare. So it'll be half the current yield. This does produce a particular challenge on how we feed ourselves. But even with those lower yields, there does appear to be a way of achieving it, and also increasing forestry cover appreciably.
So what we're saying is it doesn't look like it does now, but it can achieve it. Anne.
Yeah, before Peter gets in, I'd just like to address the question of rewilding, because I've seen a few things flying past the chat, although I'm not actually reading the chat thoroughly. We have taken rewilding into consideration. It's a question that always comes up. When we looked at devising our policy, we looked at the philosophical basis, and biodiversity is one of the main things that the Green Party is interested in. So we've taken biodiversity extremely seriously, and we have gone back and checked that we can meet the rewilding Britain targets, which are for 5% of the land to be very wild, and for 25% to be sort of slightly wild, as in things will happen on it that will enable biodiversity to thrive. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that because it's bound to come up.
Thank you. Peter, did you want to say something?
Well, apparently there's an appetite for me to say something. So I think well, a lot of what Tony said is right, and I think it's important to recognise a few things. So there was an episode of the food programme on BBC4 recently talking about Scotland bread, and that Scotland bread is an initiative to grow heritage wheats in Scotland and turn them into flour locally and to use them to produce traditional breads. In the UK, the majority of people haven't eaten traditional breads for since the start of the Industrial Revolution, really. So there's and yes, those grains have a lower yield if you don't use lots of artificial fertilizers. You get lower yields. There's lots of things in that sense, but actually it's very easy to go, well, look, how can we do this? It's a much lower yield, but there's all sorts of subtleties there. Like, well, yes, it might be a lower yield, but what if each kilogram of grain, actually has a better nutrient content? So if it has more of those micronutrients in it than we actually need, then, well, there's a question mark there about, is our yield in terms of tons per hectare really measuring the right yield? So I just point that out as an example of, it's always more complicated than you think it is. It's very easy to look at headline yield numbers and go, well, clearly that's better than that. Well,
Peter, can I just say there that if you go back to the old processes of making bread, like the sourdough, you get a lot more nutrients out of the process as well. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, that is exactly what Scotland bread was doing, was sourdough bread. Sorry. So I won't. We could talk about this for ages. I won't. I think we should get to some other questions. But I think the important thing to come back to when you're looking at that question of can we feed the country? Can we feed Britain? Well, yes, but but not on the assumption that what we do at the moment, and not on the assumption that we waste food like we do at the moment, and not on the assumption that we share food or fail to share food in the way that we do at the moment. So it's it's not as simple as we can meet current demand for food production. Clearly, no. But yes, we could deliver everyone a healthy, balanced diet if we. So the culture change and the food change, which is something we haven't got the expertise to deal with on this panel, is a whole other topic that could have a whole panel, a whole session like this on its own, is an absolutely critical part of it. But yes, from a purely land use perspective, potential.
Great, thank you. So we've got quite a technical question here, which says carbon emissions from livestock are recirculatory, while carbon emissions from fossil fuels are additional. How is that reflected in our climate change mitigation policies? It sounds like it might be one for David and Tony. But
I could talk if not.
Or Peter. Okay, fine.
Shall I say something, or did someone else want to? I'll say something that other people can chip in.
Yeah.
So Tony touched on this earlier. So basically, a lot of the emissions from animals that ruminate, so cattle, cows, and bulls and sheep, is methane. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, but it's quite a short-lived greenhouse gas, and it decays to carbon dioxide. So we know that there have been animals that ruminate on the planet Earth for millennia. They've been based on the plains for long before the Industrial Revolution. So it is possible for there to be an equilibrium that includes animals that ruminate. So yes, in that sense, some amount of ruminants can be in equilibrium without creating, climate impacts, but that doesn't mean that they don't produce emissions. It just means that there's a balance within the overall cycle. But currently we have vastly more animals than that. We have huge numbers of livestock at the moment. So there's it's complicated. The flip side of that is that a lot of carbon dioxide emissions, carbon dioxide is a very, very, very long-lived greenhouse gas. If you put that carbon dioxide up there, it stays there a very, very long time. So that's the difference. It's not as simple as one's good and one's bad.
David?
Just to add a piece of data, because before the session I looked up the concentration of atmospheric methane over the last few hundred years, and it has ramped up very considerably. So although our questioner is right to say that in principle it is recirculatory, actually what we're seeing is a big increase. And one of the advantages that flows from methane being short-lived is that if we can get the rate of methane production down, then we actually get a reduction in the warming effect. That some of that 1.1 degrees of warming we're currently experiencing can go away if we can get this. Whereas with carbon dioxide, getting the emissions level down doesn't. It stabilizes the position, doesn't give you a reduction. So there is real leverage in addressing methane.
And Tony?
Yeah, I'll just say that our policy at the moment, as I kind of said earlier, is using this carbon dioxide equivalent and trying to get to net zero in 2030. And I think that even if we expressed it differently in terms of having a methane target, a carbon dioxide target, a nitrous oxide target instead, we'd be still trying to reduce all of them as much as we can, because we are far too far off our zero carbon targets, especially in this land use and farming area, where our current calculations are, we've still got appreciable emissions from this sector in 2030. And if we allow that, we have to find other places where there would be negative emissions. And that is not easy. And so we've got to keep on pushing on all fronts.
Thank you. So I've got a question here around permaculture and farming. So saying that the way that we farm is an economic decision, which I think we've already covered. But talking about, should land workers be subsidised in order to get towards permaculture? So to support biodiversity, give work, produce more, greater variety of food and so on. So do we think that we should be directly subsidising land workers to get?
Can I respond to that? Can I take that one?
Sure.
I think I will flag this on a slightly broader point, because I think one of the key approaches that's been put forward, so Greenhouse Think Tank did a piece of work a few years ago about climate jobs, and there's been lots of other work done around climate jobs. And actually, if we want to address climate change now, we want to do things, you can allocate as much money as you like, but it's actually employing people to do things that makes things change, right? So having a jobs-led approach to the transition, having a jobs-led approach to making stuff happen, to actually intervening and reducing emissions is, I think, entirely right and absolutely critical. And yes, that applies in agriculture, but it applies in all sorts of sectors. Not if we want to retrofit homes, you can allocate as much budget as like, but until you employ some people and tell them to go and actually retrofit a home, doesn't matter how much resources, you can have stacks of insulation sitting in a warehouse somewhere, it doesn't actually do any, so jobs-led approach, yes. Whether that's how that fits into the subsidy thing, whether you directly subsidize employment is a different question, and perhaps one I don't think we can go into detail and needs more work, but having a jobs-led approach is definitely the right answer.
Anybody else have any input on that one? No? Okay, thanks, Peter. So there's a question here. Well, I suppose we could put a couple of these questions together actually. So there's one person saying, does the interest in land use extend to all land, including land that's built upon? But there's also a question around considering land and water policy in conjunction. Should we be looking at that as well? So I think both those questions are around the scope, I suppose, of what we do. So Tony?
Yes, the land use does extend to our what's called settlements, the main bit of work that we've been doing, because other parties have got themselves confused about this, is how much extra housing needs to be built. And this is coming up in two guises, conference. One is as part of this land use draft voting paper, but there's also coming to conference housing and built environment. And the current government de facto sort of targets are up at the region of about 300,000 new homes to be built a year. And the way that the draft, the voting paper for buildings is 200,000, and Peter has put in an amendment to make it more like 100,000. So we are having large discussions about this, because the more that housing you have, you've got to think how much can you put that on brownfield sites, or is there a competition for brownfield sites from new industries that we might want to kind of have back into the UK, and how much of it has to be encroaching on, as is done at the moment, into forest land, cropland and grassland?
I'll just clarify that amendment is supported by the Land Use Policy Working Group and is not just solely mine.
Yes, we do have amendments to policy proposals at conference that are friendly amendments that are supported by the people who've originally submitted them. So yes, they're not all controversial in that sense. There's an interesting question here from somebody actually about the policy working group itself, saying, do we have any traditional established practicing farmers in the group? Do we have any people who actually do work the land? They're specifically excluding intensive industrial farmers and just wanting to know if we've got any small farmers on the group.
So maybe I should respond to that. So in the Green Party, there are definitely people there. So there's a policy working group called the Food and Agriculture Working Group, which is not represented at this meeting. Perhaps that's an oversight, but maybe that's subject of another session. But there are certainly people in that who are practicing farmers. I think some of them are practicing organic farmers. And there are probably other people in the party outside of that group who have direct experience of one sort or another.
Okay, thank you. David?
Just to say that one of the questions we've had came from a practicing organic farmer.
Okay, good. Tony, were you going to say something as well? Okay. So another really interesting question here that may take some answering. Says many of the policies that are required are going to require people to accept quite radical change, maybe tax changes and redistribution, but generally the population accept climate change is happening and urgent, but a recent study has shown people are resistant to changing their behaviour. So how are we going to look at that behaviour change aspect and managing that? Oh look, you've all gone on mute now.
I'll have a go. I'll have a punt. So I think it's important to not to clearly there is going to be a need for behavioural change, and I think the food is one big aspect about that, but there's a huge amount to gain from that. So I don't think in a lot of food interventions, although behavioural change is required, often that's not the barrier. I'm not a food policy change expert, but free school meals, and what's on the menu, and what food served in hospitals, and all those things have huge impact in food culture and what people are eating, what children want to eat, and all sorts of things like that. And actually the barrier to a lot of those things is budget and training and skills and policy, and not the fact that people won't eat healthy nutritious food if that's what's on the menu. But I think when it comes back to the land use thing more broadly, I think a lot of the problem is not, behavioural change has clearly got to happen as part of the solution, but I don't think the first thing to think about is the behavioural change. I think the first thing to think about is, well, we haven't currently got the right policy, the right economic circumstances to motivate the changes that need to happen. Doing the right thing by biodiversity is not currently the cheapest option. You don't get subsidised to do it in a lot of cases. Growing agroecological food in a sustainable way is not what's currently economically encouraged. In fact, the direct opposite is encouraged in a lot of circumstances. So I think if the economics changed, if the policy lever interventions in terms of what was taxed or subsidised, what the planning system allowed, and that would then create a framework in which people could make the behavioural changes. And that I think a lot of people, you know, if those things are approached in the right way, would embrace that. And there was one thing that wasn't mentioned earlier that relates to this, which is having a strategic approach. And Anne touched upon this when she was talking about strategy and the planning process. But if we want to deliver significant land use change, we need a planned approach to some of that, and we needed to have a strategic approach to that, and therefore we need a land use strategy. You know, in the same way as we need a spatial strategy in terms of how we want to direct our economy and the economic side of it, we also need a land use spatial strategy. And that's one of the key policy levers, you know, is that we need to, you know, have targets of what we want to change in land use, and then have a planned approach to, well, to deliver, you know, which body is going to deliver that land use change, and what these are the levers available to them, and, you know, giving them the power to go and actually go and do that.
So David, you wanted to add something?
Well, very briefly, it isn't really that I disagree, but I'm perhaps a bit more pessimistic on a couple of grounds. One is that we need to make these changes awfully fast. We're talking about a 10-year, actually a 9-year timescale. That's really very little for processes which have to go through design and training and implementation. It's a lot of steps. The second is that if we were just changing land use, that would be one thing, but we aren't. The Green Party policy set in total changes, well, almost everything in terms of where you go on holiday, in terms of how you get to work, in terms of what you eat, in terms of where clothing is sourced from. There are an awful lot of things. Some of those people don't have to care about because they will affect only the production processes, but quite a lot of them will and must change the way people behave. And that's an awful lot of behavior change taken in aggregate. It seems to me that that is only workable if we win the argument with people that climate change is not only real and dangerous, but that it is absolutely an emergency and has to be tackled as such.
Thank you. Thanks, David. And Anne, you wanted to
yeah, I
add
think David sort of touched on what I was going to say, but in terms of land use itself, I think although there will be some behaviour change required, a lot of the policies that we have will see, I mean, for example, like land ownership, for most people, it won't see a great deal of change. It will see change for some people, but I think a lot of the stuff for me feels more sort of about system change rather than about individual change. I'm not saying that makes it any easier. It's just slightly different perhaps to some of the other stuff where, I don't know, we need to have the systems put in place before people can really start to change. I think we're a lot further behind on land use and people's knowledge about it than we are on, for example, how to save carbon or how to do recycling and stuff like that.
Okay, thanks, Anne. So, I mean, I think my kind of closing point on that, because we're out of time now, would be to come back to that point of looking at positive futures and saying what are the positives of all these changes, rather than just the negative things that we're trying to prevent, so that people can see the benefits of what we're saying, and have something to look forward to, and something exciting and new in the future. Well, thank you all very much. So we've run out of time now. I'm sure we could have carried on for a very long time talking about this particular policy area. So for everybody, thank you for attending. And please remember that these policy sessions are happening roughly once every fortnight. You should be getting information in your inbox telling you about the next event. And please come along to conference and support the various policy proposals that come from the policy working groups, and please join the policy working groups and contribute to their success. So thanks again to the panel. Thank you all for attending, and hopefully we'll see you on a Zoom call soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Phil.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.